Tonight, I have another quiet story to share with you. First, please turn the volume down a little and adjust it to a comfortable level. And if you think you may want to return tomorrow night, you may wish to subscribe now so this channel will be easy to find whenever you are ready to sleep again. When you get into bed, thoughts about today or tomorrow may fill your mind, and you may feel pressure to fall asleep. But there is no need to force it. Simply let my quiet voice draw your attention away from those thoughts. You do not need to follow every word. Just let it drift by like soft background music. And if you fall asleep along the way, that is perfectly all right. Now, let us slowly begin tonight's story. Tonight, our story begins at the edge of a continent, where the land of California meets the great Pacific Ocean. There, between the northern end of the San Francisco Peninsula and the hills of Marin County, lies a narrow passage of water. It is called the Golden Gate Bridge. Through this opening, the waters of San Francisco Bay meet the open sea. Today, it is difficult to imagine this place without the bridge. The two tall towers seem to belong to the landscape. The long cables rise and fall in gentle curves. The roadway appears to float above the water. In fog, parts of the bridge may disappear, leaving only a tower, a cable, or a faint line of orange suspended in pale gray air. But the bridge has stood there only since 1937. Long before there was steel, concrete, traffic, or electric light, the landscape itself was changing. The Golden Gate Bridge is a gap through a mountain range. According to the history presented by the Golden Gate Bridge District, the gap was cut by an ancient river. At that time, the land that is now San Francisco Bay was a dry valley. Sea level was far lower than it is today. Then, as the last ice age ended, melting ice raised the oceans. Water slowly entered the old river canyon. Over time, the broad bay took shape behind the narrow gate. Even now, much of the rain and snow that falls across California eventually drains through this passage. Water moves between bay and ocean. Tides pass through the narrow opening. Winds travel across the headlands. Fog gathers over the cold water and enters the bay. All of these natural forces would later become part of the bridge's story. The current could be powerful. The water could be deep. Wind and fog could make work difficult and navigation uncertain. Salt in the air could settle on steel. And only a few miles offshore lay the San Andreas Fault, a reminder that the ground beneath the region was not always still. Before thinking about the people who designed the bridge, it may be restful to remain with this older landscape for a little while. Imagine the headlands without a roadway between them. Imagine looking north from the San Francisco side. Across the moving water, the Marin Hills rise on the opposite shore. There is no tower interrupting the sky. There is no line of traffic. There are no suspension cables. The only connection between one side and the other is the water itself. The land around the strait has a human history extending thousands of years. The Presidio's account identifies this area as part of the traditional territory of the Yelamu, a local tribe of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples. Archaeological evidence from the area around Crissy Field shows that people lived here when local plants, fish, and other animals were available for harvest. For those communities, The shore was not an empty place waiting for a bridge. It was already a lived landscape, known through paths, seasons, food, family, and memory. Centuries later, European powers entered the region. In 1776, Spanish settlers established the Presidio near the entrance to the bay. It served both to guard the harbor and to support the nearby mission. After Mexico became independent from Spain in 1821, the Presidio became a Mexican outpost. During the Mexican-American War, the United States Army began using the site, beginning a military presence that would continue until 1994. The place that would one day hold the southern end of the Golden Gate Bridge was therefore already shaped by layers of history. There were indigenous homelands, Spanish settlement, Mexican administration, and an American military post. There were changing roads, buildings, defenses, and communities. And always, beside them, there was the narrow strait. The city itself grew with remarkable speed. In 1848, San Francisco had fewer than 500 residents. Then came the gold rush. In a very short time, the population became many times larger. Ships arrived. Streets spread across hills. Businesses opened. People came from many parts of the world, often with urgent hopes and uncertain plans. By the early years of the 20th century, the population of the Bay Area had reached around 1 million. The region was becoming more connected by railways, roads, ferries, and commerce. Yet the Golden Gate still interrupted the main north-south route along the California coast. Highway 101 could approach the strait from either direction, but it could not cross the water. The distance was not enormous when seen on a map. The strait itself was about a mile wide at the crossing. But maps do not show the full experience of deep water, changing tides, strong winds, fog, military concerns, ship traffic, and the enormous cost of building over open water. For many years, the Golden Gate remained a boundary. People could look across it. Boats could pass through it, but a road could not continue over it. Before the bridge, the practical short connection between San Francisco and Marin County was the ferry. Ferry service in the region began early in the 19th century. Regularly scheduled service developed in the 1840s. In 1867, the Sausalito Land and Ferry Company began operating. Over the years, ferry travel became a normal and important part of life around the bay. A passenger could leave San Francisco by boat and arrive in Marin County. Later, automobiles could also be carried across the water. By the 1920s, ferry service had become a major business. The Golden Gate Ferry Company was eventually combined with the ferry system of the Southern Pacific Railroad. The resulting operation was described as the largest ferry operation in the world. The ferries were useful, profitable, and familiar. A crossing from Hyde Street Pier in San Francisco to Sausalito took about 20 minutes. From the ferry building, the trip took a little longer. Before the bridge opened, carrying a vehicle could cost $1. For the traveler, the journey may have had its own rhythm. A car would wait to board. The ferry would move away from the pier. San Francisco would slowly recede. wind and water would surround the deck. The destination would draw closer. We should be careful not to imagine every journey as peaceful. Ferries operated as transportation, and travelers had schedules, work, deliveries, and appointments. Fog and weather could complicate the trip. Line could form. Capacity was limited. Still, for more than a century, boats provided the connection that the land could not. The future bridge would not simply cross an empty space. It would compete with a thriving transportation system and with powerful companies whose business depended on the water route. That opposition would become important later. For now, picture the two shores as they appeared in the early 20th century. San Francisco had become a major American city, but it remained unusually dependent on ferries. Communities north of the Golden Gate were close in distance, and yet separated by water. Goods and people could cross, but not by a continuous road. The idea of a bridge returned again and again. Perhaps someone standing on the shore could look across and think that the distance did not seem impossible. Perhaps, on a clear day, the opposite land appeared near enough to invite the question, why not build a bridge? The question was simple. The answer was not. The water in the center of the channel was extremely deep. Tides and currents moved through the narrow strait. Fog could obscure the entire passage. Strong winds came from the Pacific. Large ships needed to enter and leave the bay. The bridge would have to stand high above the water and span a distance greater than any suspension bridge then in existence. Many experts believed it could not be done. Some thought construction itself would be impossible. Others questioned whether a completed bridge could safely operate in the wind and fog. The project seemed to ask too much of the engineering of its time. And yet, during the early decades of the 20th century, bridge engineering was changing. Longer spans were becoming possible. New theories were being developed. Steel production had advanced. Builders had learned from earlier suspension bridges. What had once been an impossible idea was slowly becoming a difficult possibility. The distinction mattered. An impossible thing needs only to be dismissed. A difficult possibility asks people to calculate, test, argue, finance, design, and try. And so, gradually, the Golden Gate Bridge moved from imagination toward plans on paper. In 1916, a proposal appeared in the San Francisco Bulletin. The article was written by James Wilkins, a former engineering student. It described the possibility of building a bridge across the Golden Gate. The idea itself was not entirely new, but this proposal helped bring the question into public discussion in a more serious way. San Francisco's city engineer studied the idea and estimated that such a bridge might cost $100 million. At the time, that figure made the project seem impractical. The city engineer then asked bridge engineers whether the crossing could be built for less. One of the people who responded was Joseph Behrman Strauss. Strauss was an ambitious engineer. He had designed many bridges, especially drawbridges. He was also a poet, and he possessed a strong sense of the importance of great public works. Yet he had not built anything on the scale of the Golden Gate crossing. His first proposal was very different from the bridge we know today. It included large cantilever structures extending from both shores, with a suspended central section between them. The design was heavy in appearance. The local press criticized it. Later descriptions would remember it as awkward or unattractive. But Strauss believed the bridge could be built at a much lower cost than the earlier estimate. He proposed a figure of about $17 million. This was still a great amount of money, but it brought the idea closer to political possibility. Strauss would spend more than a decade promoting the bridge. That long period is an important part of the story. The Golden Gate Bridge did not appear simply because one engineer made a drawing. It required years of meetings, reports, hearings, negotiations, public arguments, legal disputes, revisions, and persuasion. For a quiet moment, imagine the bridge during those years not as steel, but as paper. There were maps showing the strait. There were lines drawn between the headlands. There were cost estimates. There were calculations. There were newspaper illustrations. There were letters from supporters and objections from opponents. There were proposals for roads approaching the bridge. There were questions about ships, land, jobs, military security, and debt. The bridge existed first as a repeated conversation. Strauss became the most visible advocate. He spoke of the project, defended it, revised it, and worked to gather support throughout Northern California. The bridge also gathered allies. The growing automobile industry supported roads and bridges that would allow more people to travel by car. Communities north of San Francisco hoped for easier access to the city. Business leaders imagined greater movement of people and goods. Many residents believed that a permanent connection could help the region grow. But opposition was strong. The Department of War was concerned about navigation through the harbor entrance. The United States Navy worried that a ship collision, an attack, or a damaged bridge might block access to an important harbor. Labor unions wanted assurances that local workers would receive preference for construction jobs. And the ferry companies had an obvious reason to object. A bridge would compete directly with their service. Southern Pacific, which had major interests in the ferry system, opposed the project and pursued legal action. At one point, public anger over the resistance contributed to a boycott of ferry service. The disagreement was not merely between people who loved bridges and people who did not. Different groups saw different risks. The military saw the entrance to a strategic harbor. The ferry companies saw a threat to a profitable operation. Unions saw the possibility of jobs, but wanted protection for local labor. Taxpayers and property owners saw the possibility of debt. Engineers saw a difficult physical problem. Supporters saw a route to regional growth. The same stretch of water carried many meanings. In 1924, a hearing was held concerning the use of federal land for the bridge and its approaches. Approval was eventually given for the transfer of land needed for the structure and roads, provided that further plans were accepted. That approval was essential because the southern end of the proposed bridge passed through the Presidio, which was federal military property. The relationship between the bridge and the Presidio was therefore present from the beginning. The bridge could not simply arrive at the San Francisco shore wherever its designers wished. It had to enter a landscape already occupied by military roads, batteries, buildings, and Fort Point, the brick fort standing near the water. The final design would have to respect those conditions. The name Golden Gate Bridge also became established during these years. The bridge was not named for its color. It was named for the strait it crossed. The term Golden Gate had been used for the passage long before the bridge existed. In 1923, the California legislature passed an act creating a special district to design, build, and finance the crossing. The organization would eventually become known as the Golden Gate Bridge and Highway District. Several counties in Northern California joined the district. The official history emphasizes that people in 6 counties would ultimately vote to support the project. This regional structure was important because San Francisco alone was not expected to carry the entire burden. The bridge was intended to connect a wider area, and its financing would involve communities beyond the city. Still, even after a district existed, the bridge was far from certain. There was not yet a final design. There was not yet enough money. There was not yet steel rising from the water. There was only the idea, growing more detailed and more difficult to stop. By the late 1920s, engineers were moving away from Strauss's original cantilever proposal. Consulting engineers Leon S. Moisseiff and Othmar H. Amann encouraged Strauss to accept a more graceful all-suspension design. A suspension bridge carries its roadway from large cables. The cables pass over tall towers and are anchored firmly at each end. Smaller vertical suspender ropes connect the roadway structure to the main cables. This arrangement allows a long central span without piers standing in the main shipping channel. For the Golden Gate, that was essential. The bridge needed to leave a wide, clear passage below for ships entering and departing San Francisco Bay. It also had to stretch across deep, turbulent water. By 1929, Strauss had accepted the suspension form that would become familiar around the world. But choosing the general type of bridge did not solve the engineering problem. The proposed central span was 4,200 feet long. That was longer than the main span of any suspension bridge then standing. The towers would rise 746 feet above the water. The roadway would hang about 220 feet above high water, high enough for ships to pass below. The entire bridge, from one end to the other, would extend for roughly 1.7 miles. These dimensions were not simply impressive numbers. Each number created another question. How much load would the cables carry? How tall and strong should the towers be? How would the deck move in the wind? What kind of rock lay beneath the South Tower? How could workers build a foundation more than 1,000 feet from shore? How would steel sections reach the site? How could thousands of wires be turned into cables in mid-air? How could the bridge remain flexible enough to respond to wind and weight without becoming unstable? Much of the detailed work fell to Charles Alton Ellis. Ellis was a mathematician, scholar, and engineer. Strauss assigned him to collaborate with Leon Moisseiff on the calculations for the bridge. They worked in an age before electronic computers. Stringural calculations were performed with pencil, paper, tables, and slide rules. Drawings were made by hand on drafting boards. Changes that might now be tested rapidly by software required long sequences of careful calculation. Ellis worked intensely on the project. The mathematical labor was extensive. Forces had to be traced through cables, towers, anchorages, suspenders, trusses, and foundations. The bridge had to carry its own enormous weight, along with traffic, wind, and changing conditions. Moisseiff contributed a modern approach known as deflection theory. The basic idea was that the roadway did not need to be completely rigid. A long suspension bridge could flex. If the deck moved in a controlled way, some forces could be transferred through the suspension system, rather than resisted by massive stiffness alone. This flexibility would later become visible during large crowds and strong weather. The bridge was not designed to behave like an unmoving stone wall. It was designed to respond. That does not mean it was loose or fragile. Its movement was calculated as part of its strength. There is something quietly interesting in that idea. A structure can endure not only by refusing to move, but also by moving within limits. The bridge would rise and fall slightly with changing loads and temperature. It could sway in wind. The great cables could carry forces toward the towers and anchorages. Its strength would include a measured kind of flexibility. The engineers did not rely on calculations alone. They tested a steel model of a tower at a scale of 1 to 56. At Princeton University, the model was placed in a testing machine. Scaled forces were applied to represent the enormous loads that the full tower would carry. The tests supported the calculations. The geology beneath the South Tower was also examined. The planned location was more than 1,100 feet offshore. The foundation would rest on serpentine rock beneath the water. Consulting geologist Andrew Lawson supervised a load test. A great weight, equivalent to a fully loaded railroad boxcar, was placed on a very small area of the rock. The rock proved strong enough. Little by little, uncertain questions received measured answers. Could the tower carry the cable load? A model could be tested. Could the rock support the tower? The rock could be loaded. Could the suspension system span the distance? The forces could be calculated. The bridge was still not built, but it was becoming less a dream and more a design. The Golden Gate Bridge was not only an engineering problem, it was also a question of appearance. A bridge of this size would transform one of the most dramatic entrances to any harbor. It would stand beside the Presidio, above Fort Point, between ocean and bay. Even people who supported the project could disagree about what it should look like. Early drawings included grand gateways and monumental buildings at the approaches. Some designs imagined neoclassical entrances framing the roadway. These proposals were not built. Instead, the final bridge developed a cleaner, more structural character. Irving F. Morrow, a consulting architect, played a central role in shaping that character. Morrow designed or refined many of the features that gave the bridge its visual identity. He worked on the forms of the towers, the lighting, the railings, the walkways, and the Art Deco details. The towers were not treated merely as piles of steel holding cables. Their vertical lines were emphasized. Their openings stepped inward as they rose. Their surfaces and proportions created a sense of height. The repeated geometry gave them a modern appearance suited to the 1930s. Art Deco was visible in smaller elements as well. Streetlights, railings, and other details followed a unified visual language. The bridge became both an industrial structure and a carefully composed work of architecture. Morrow was also closely associated with the bridge's color. Steel arriving for construction carried a reddish-orange primer. The color was visible in the landscape, against hills, water, and fog. The United States Navy proposed a bold pattern of black and yellow stripes to improve visibility to ships. That scheme would have made the bridge unmistakable, but it would have created a very different landmark. Morrow supported the warm orange color instead. The final shade became known as International Orange. It offered visibility in fog while also relating to the natural colors of the surrounding land. Against blue water, gray sky, green hills, or white fog, the orange steel could remain distinct. The bridge is sometimes casually called red, but its historic color is International Orange. It is a color chosen not because the bridge crossed the Golden Gate, and not because the metal was intended to resemble gold, but because a practical protective coating suggested an aesthetic possibility. What began as primer became identity. Imagine for a moment that the Navy's proposal had been selected. The same towers might have risen over the same water, but in alternating bands of black and yellow. The bridge would still have carried traffic. It might still have set engineering records. Yet the impression would have been entirely different. The bridge that people now recognize in photographs, paintings, films, and memories depends not only on its dimensions, but on this decision of color. The structure and the landscape seem to answer one another. The orange is bright, but not cold. It stands out, but it does not seem detached from the hills. In fog, it may appear gradually, one section at a time. Sometimes a tower is clear while the roadway disappears. Sometimes the cables fade into cloud. Sometimes the bridge seems to begin on land and then continue into a blank space. The color helps each visible part remain connected to the whole, even when the whole cannot be seen. Another delicate design problem waited at the San Francisco end. Fort Point stood directly beneath the path of the proposed bridge. The fort was a masonry structure built before the American Civil War. It occupied a strategic position at the narrow entrance to the bay. One solution would have been to demolish it, but even at that time, Fort Point was regarded as historically important. Charles Ellis was asked to develop a way for the bridge to pass above the fort without destroying it. The result was a graceful steel arch. The roadway approaches the main suspension span by crossing over Fort Point on this arch, sometimes described as a bridge within the bridge. This feature is easy to overlook from a distance. The two enormous towers and the sweeping main cables naturally attract attention. Yet beneath the southern approach, the arch preserves a much older structure. The bridge, therefore, did not erase every trace of what stood before it. It adapted. The old fort remained below. The modern roadway passed above. One structure belonged to the age of masonry coastal defense. The other belonged to the age of steel, automobiles, and long-span engineering. They occupied the same place. This solution also reveals how many different kinds of thought were required to complete the bridge. There were calculations of cable tension and tower load. There were tests of bedrock. There were questions of public finance. There were concerns about ship navigation. There were decisions about color, railings, and light. And there was the need to preserve a historic fort while carrying a highway over it. No single person was responsible for every part. Joseph Strauss remained chief engineer and public leader of the project. His persistence was essential. Leon Moisseiff helped shape the suspension design and structural theory. Otmar Ammann contributed as a consulting engineer and advocate for the all-suspension form. Charles Ellis performed a great share of the difficult analytical work. Irving Morrow gave the bridge much of its architectural expression. Geologists, traffic engineers, contractors, draftsmen, surveyors, steelworkers, divers, electricians, painters, and many others would also contribute. For many years, public credit did not fully reflect this collaboration. Strauss was the most prominent figure and often received the greatest recognition. Ellis, in particular, received little credit during his lifetime for the extensive calculations he completed. Their working relationship ended bitterly. In 1931, Strauss dismissed Ellis from the project. Ellis nevertheless continued working on calculations without pay for a period, producing volumes of technical work. Only much later did the Golden Gate Bridge District formally recognize the importance of Ellis's contribution. The history of the bridge is therefore not a simple story of one heroic designer. It is the story of a determined chief engineer, but also of a large and sometimes troubled collaboration. The finished bridge appears unified. Its history is not. Like many great works, it contains cooperation, disagreement, ambition, skill, recognition, and neglect. At night, when the towers are quiet and the calculations are no longer visible, it may be easy to think of the bridge as a single idea. But behind each curve of cable stood many minds. Behind each line on the skyline stood many sheets of paper. Behind the apparent simplicity of the finished structure stood years of complicated human effort. Even with a design taking shape, one enormous question remained. Who would pay for it? The Golden Gate Bridge and Highway District was incorporated in 1928 as the official organization responsible for designing, constructing, and financing the bridge. Then, in 1929, the stock market crashed. The United States entered the Great Depression. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Unemployment rose. Money became scarce. A bridge that had always been difficult to finance now had to seek support in one of the worst economic periods in American history. The district proposed a bond issue of $30 million. Voters in the counties participating in the district were asked to support the bonds. The measure passed in November 1930. This vote meant that local property would stand behind the debt. For supporters, it was an act of confidence in the future. For property owners, it also involved real risk. The bridge did not yet exist. The economy was deeply uncertain. There was no guarantee that toll revenue would meet every expectation. Nevertheless, voters approved the plan. Approval, however, did not immediately produce cash. The district still had to sell the bonds, and in the financial climate of the early 1930s, buyers were difficult to find. The project might have stopped there. A legal authority existed. A design existed. Public approval existed. But without someone willing to purchase the bonds, construction could not begin. In 1932, Amedeo Peter Giannini, founder of the San Francisco-based Bank of America, agreed that the bank would buy the entire bond issue. The decision helped unlock the project. Giannini believed the bridge would support the regional economy. The bond purchase provided the financing needed to move from planning into construction. The story is sometimes told as a dramatic moment, and it was certainly decisive. Still, it rested on years of earlier work. The voters had first agreed to the debt. Engineers had made the bridge credible enough to finance. Political and legal structures had been created. Land issues had been addressed. Only then could the bank's commitment carry the project forward. Construction was budgeted at about $27 million when the bonds were approved. The completed project would ultimately cost more than $35 million. Even so, the bridge was finished ahead of schedule and below the final authorized budget. That achievement is often listed as one of the surprising facts about the Golden Gate Bridge. It began during the Great Depression. It crossed a site many had called impossible. It involved new scale, deep water, high wind, and enormous steelwork. Yet the main structure was completed in a little more than 4 years. Before any of that work began, however, there was one more transition. The bridge had to leave the world of drawings and enter the landscape. Survey marks had to become foundations. Large on paper had to become steel in the air. The quiet shore had to become a construction site. Construction officially began on January 5, 1933. A little more than a month later, on February 26, a large groundbreaking celebration took place at Crissy Field, close to the future southern approach of the bridge. At least 100,000 people attended. There was a parade through the Marina District. Engineering students carried an 80-foot model of the bridge. 250 carrier pigeons were released to carry news of the groundbreaking across California. The scene must have felt very different from the quiet, gray images often associated with the bridge today. There were crowds, flags, movement, speeches, and celebration. The bridge still existed mostly as plans and promises, but the public event announced that the long period of argument had finally become a period of building. The ceremony came after actual work had already begun, which is another small reminder that public history and construction history do not always start on exactly the same day. The contractors and workers now faced the physical Golden Gate. They faced wind, They faced cold water. They faced tides and fog. They faced the task of making two enormous towers rise from places where no tower had stood. The work would be carried out by several major contractors and many subcontractors. Different companies took responsibility for foundations, anchorages, structural steel, cables, electrical systems, roadway sections, and approach roads. Steel was fabricated far from California and transported to the site. Concrete had to be placed on land and underwater. Temporary structures had to be built before permanent ones could begin. The project required a carefully ordered sequence. First, foundations and anchorages, then towers, then main cables, then suspender ropes, then roadway sections. Each stage depended on the previous one. The road could not hang until cables existed. The cables could not carry weight until towers and anchorages were ready. The towers could not rise until the foundations were secure. And the most difficult foundation lay in deep, moving water more than 1,000 feet from the San Francisco shore. The South Tower presented one of the greatest challenges of the entire project. Its location was approximately 1,100 feet offshore from San Francisco. To reach it, workers constructed a temporary timber trestle extending from shore. The trestle served as an access road and work platform, carrying people, equipment, and materials toward the foundation site. This temporary structure was exposed to the same forces that made the permanent bridge so difficult. In 1933, a freighter struck the trestle. The damage had to be repaired. Then, only 2 months later, a storm destroyed more than half of the restored structure. The workers rebuilt it again. Temporary work is sometimes absent from the final memory of a great structure. Visitors see towers, cables, roadway, and concrete. They do not see the timber platforms that were damaged and replaced. They do not see the work that existed only long enough to make later work possible. Yet without the trestle, the South Tower could not have been built. Below the water, divers prepared the foundation. They descended as deep as 110 feet into the Golden Gate Bridge. The water was cold, dark, and cloudy. The current was normally too strong for safe work. Divers had to wait for periods around the changing tide, when the flow weakened. These calmer intervals occurred 4 times a day. Portable scuba tanks did not yet exist. The diver wore heavy equipment and a helmet. Air came through a hose connected to pumps at the surface. That hose was a lifeline. Communication, movement, and visibility were limited. The seabed was uneven. Loose material covered the rock. Divers placed explosive charges to break away material. High-pressure hoses were used to clear the surface down to bedrock. Later, divers guided large forms and funnels into position so that concrete could be placed accurately underwater. It is possible to describe this work in a few sentences. To perform it was something else entirely. Imagine descending slowly beneath the surface. Daylight fades. The current presses against the suit and hose. Sound changes underwater. The diver cannot simply look across the work area in the way a worker on land might. Much of the task depends on touch, preparation, and the support of people above. The timing must match the tide. Air must continue to flow. Tools must be positioned. Charges must be placed. loose rock must be removed. Forms must be guided toward a foundation that will eventually carry one of the tallest bridge towers in the world. The work was dangerous, but it was also precise. A small error beneath the water could affect everything built above. Decompression chambers were kept nearby because a diver who rose too rapidly could suffer from decompression sickness, commonly called the bends. The official exhibit notes this detail calmly, but it helps us understand how new and difficult the work was. The bridge depended not only on visible workers high above the water, but also on workers moving in darkness below it. High and low, air and water, tower tops and bedrock. The project extended through the entire vertical space of the strait. Around the South Tower foundation, workers built a massive oval concrete barrier called a fender. Its permanent purpose was to help protect the tower from ships, especially in fog. Its temporary purpose was equally important. The fender created an enclosed area in which the foundation and lower tower work could proceed. Concrete was sent through tubes into wooden forms beneath the water. As the concrete structure rose above the surface, workers began calling it the giant bathtub. The nickname made the immense engineering structure sound ordinary and domestic. Yet this was no ordinary bathtub. It stood in the Golden Gate, surrounded by tides and ship traffic. Inside it would rest the base of the South Tower. Concrete was first placed underwater to fill the lower part of the foundation area. Then the remaining seawater inside the fender had to be removed. Approximately 9.4 million gallons of water were pumped out. Once the interior was dry enough for work, crews installed reinforcing steel and placed more concrete. The completed foundation connected the future tower to the rock beneath the strait. It also transformed the work environment. Where there had been open water, workers now had an enclosed space. Where divers had worked below the surface, other crews could now work inside the giant concrete oval. The sequence is worth following slowly. First, reach the offshore site with a temporary trestle. Then, clear and examine the seabed. Then, place forms underwater. Then, build the protective fender upward. Then, place concrete below the water. Then, pump millions of gallons of water from the enclosure. Then, install steel reinforcement and more concrete. Only after all of this could the visible steel tower begin to rise. The South Tower construction therefore began long before the tower could be seen. Its first great achievement was hidden beneath the surface. The North Tower, located closer to the Marin shore, did not require the same enormous offshore enclosure. But it too needed a secure foundation and careful preparation. The two towers would look like twins when completed. Their foundations were not identical. The bridge's symmetry above water rested on different conditions below. That is often true of structures, and perhaps of many other things. What appears balanced at the surface may be supported by unequal work beneath it. In January 1935, with the south foundation ready, workers began erecting the tower's steel. Only 6 months later, the South Tower was complete. After years of planning and long underwater effort, the rise of the tower was comparatively rapid. One prefabricated section followed another. The silhouette began to appear over the water. The Golden Gate was no longer merely the future site of a bridge. It now held vertical steel. The idea had become visible from far away. The two main towers were 746 feet tall above the water. When the bridge was completed, they were the tallest bridge towers in the world. Their height was not chosen simply to create a dramatic skyline. In a suspension bridge, tall towers help guide the pulling forces of the main cables upward. The roadway hangs below. The cables curve over the towers and continue down toward great anchorages on land. Each tower had to receive the weight and tension carried by the cables. At the top of a full-sized tower, the vertical load from the main cables was calculated at roughly 120 million pounds. That enormous load had been represented in the earlier model tests. Now, steel had to carry it in the real wind above the real strait. The tower steel was manufactured at Bethlehem steel plants in Pennsylvania. From there, it traveled by ship through the Panama Canal and onward to San Francisco Bay. This long journey connected distant industrial regions to the construction site. Steel made in the eastern United States passed south toward the canal, crossed between oceans, and then traveled north along the Pacific coast. When the sections arrived, they were lifted from barges and assembled into the growing towers. The work used climbing derricks. A temporary platform carrying cranes was positioned between the two legs of a tower. The cranes lifted prefabricated steel sections into place. When work at one level was complete, the platform and cranes moved upward. Then the process began again. Lift, point, place, right the platform, repeat. From below, the tower might appear to grow steadily. For the workers, growth happened piece by piece. Each section had to align with the structure beneath it. Rivet holes had to meet. Temporary connections had to hold. Permanent connections had to be completed. The steel was joined with rivets. Across the two towers, approximately 1.2 million rivets were used. Each tower contained around 600,000. A rivet began as a metal fastener heated until it was red hot. It was inserted through aligned holes in steel plates and shaped to create a tight, permanent connection as it cooled. Teams of workers handled this process again and again. The number is difficult to imagine. One rivet is small enough to hold 1,200,000 becomes part of a landscape. Perhaps it is easier to think of the towers as being made not only from great plates and beams, but from hundreds of thousands of repeated acts. Heat the rivet. Move it into position. Place it through the steel. Shape the end. Allow it to cool and tighten. Then move to the next one, and the next. The towers rose higher than a 60-story building. Workers sometimes needed 20 minutes simply to climb ladders to reach their work area. The climb itself was part of the day. Below them was water. Around them were wind and fog. Above them was the next unfinished level. From a distance, the towers now seem broad, stable, and calm. Up close, they are networks of steel plates, braces, cells, openings, and connections. Their apparent simplicity is created by repetition and scale. The openings in each tower become narrower as they rise. The Art Deco shaping emphasizes upward movement. The orange surfaces catch changing light. But during construction, the surfaces were active work zones. Cranes moved, materials arrived, workers climbed, rivets were heated, pins rose, fog passed through incomplete steel. The wind that later traffic would experience was already present, moving around open frames before the towers were enclosed and finished. The towers did not stand alone. At each end of the bridge, enormous concrete anchorages were built to hold the ends of the main cables. A suspension cable does not simply rest on a tower. It passes over the tower and pulls downward toward the land. The anchorage must resist that pull. The forces of the bridge are therefore carried in a continuous path. The roadway loads the vertical suspenders. The suspenders pull on the main cables. The cables pass over the towers. The towers carry vertical forces into their foundations. The cable ends pull against the anchorages. All of these parts work together. If one looks only at the roadway, much of the structure is hidden from attention. If one looks only at the towers, the anchorages may seem like low concrete masses at the ends. Yet the bridge depends on the entire system. The towers create height. The cables create the long curve. The anchorages hold the tension. The suspenders carry the deck. The foundations connect the towers to rock. The trusses give the roadway stiffness. Each part performs a different task. During construction, the order mattered. By the middle of 1935, both towers were ready. The anchorages were also prepared. The empty air between the towers now waited for the main cables. At that moment, the bridge looked tall but incomplete. Two orange towers rose on opposite sides of the central span. No roadway crossed between them. No great cable curves connected shore to shore. The towers were like gates without a path. The next stage would create the bridge's most recognizable lines. But the cables could not arrive as finished objects. Each cable would weigh about 12,000 tons and measure a little more than 3 feet in diameter. There was no practical way to manufacture such a cable elsewhere, place it on a ship, and lift it over the towers. Instead, the cables would be made in the air. They would be created wire by wire, traveling back and forth across the Golden Gate thousands of times. The process was called cable spinning. It had been developed in the 19th century by John A. Roebling, whose company later produced the cables for the Golden Gate Bridge. The idea was simple to describe and immense to perform. A wire about as thick as a pencil was carried from one anchorage up over a tower, across the central span, over the second tower, and down to the anchorage on the opposite shore. There it was secured. Then another length was carried back. The movement continued from side to side, one direction, then the other, again and again. Each finished main cable contained 27,572 parallel wires. There were 2 main cables. Together, the wires stretched for an estimated total of about 80,000 miles. That length would circle the Earth more than 3 times. But the wires were not laid in a straight line around the world. They were gathered into 2 dense cables, each following a graceful curve over the Golden Gate. The cable spinning equipment used steel wheels to carry wire across the span. Workers guided the process, controlled tension, arranged the wires into strands, and watched for proper placement. The thin wires were first grouped. Those groups became heavier strands. The strands were then compacted together by hydraulic equipment to form a round cable. The completed cable was bound and protected. What appears from a distance as one solid line is therefore a bundle of thousands upon thousands of individual lines. This is another quality of the bridge that becomes almost meditative when considered slowly. The main cables look simple. They curve from anchorage to tower, from tower to tower, and from tower to anchorage. Yet their strength comes from repetition. One wire is not the cable. 100 wires are not the cable. The cable emerges from tens of thousands of parallel wires held together and sharing the load. The official full-sized cable cross-section displayed near the bridge makes this visible. Inside the circular form, the many wires can be seen packed closely together. During construction, however, the cable did not begin as a finished circle. It began with movement across empty space. Picture the first few wires between the towers. They would have looked almost impossibly thin against the scale of the strait. Then more wires followed. The line became a bundle. The bundle became strands. The strands became a cable more than 3 feet wide. The work was completed with remarkable speed. Spinning both main cables took 6 months and 9 days. The operation set records for efficiency. The achievement depended on planning and repetition rather than one dramatic lift. There was no single moment when a complete cable suddenly appeared. The bridge acquired its strength gradually, wire after wire, crossing after crossing, day after day. Once the main cables were complete, workers attached cable bands at regular intervals. Over these bands, they placed vertical steel suspender ropes. The suspenders extended downward to support the roadway structure. There were 250 pairs of suspender ropes. Seen along the length of the bridge, they resembled the strings of a giant harp. This comparison is especially fitting in fog or evening light. The main cable forms the upper curve. The vertical suspenders descend in repeating lines. The roadway runs below them. Wind moves through the open space. The bridge is not literally a musical instrument, of course, but its geometry can suggest one. Each pair of suspenders supports a section of the deck. The weight travels upward through the suspenders to the main cable. The cable carries that force toward the towers and anchorages. Only after this hanging system was ready could the roadway cross the central span. One great advantage of the suspension design was that the road could be built without temporary supports rising from the water beneath the entire span. The deck was assembled in sections. Work proceeded outward in a balanced manner from the towers. A section was lifted into position and connected to the suspenders. Then another section followed. Building in balance helped prevent unequal loading on the developing structure. The steel trusses along the sides of the roadway were made from repeating triangular forms. They supported cross beams beneath the road and helped stiffen the deck against wind. The trusses extended between the vertical suspenders in 50-foot sections. Although they can appear shallow from a distant viewpoint, they are about 25 feet deep. The roadway was therefore not simply a flat strip hanging from cables. Below and beside the pavement stood a deep steel framework. This framework distributed weight and resisted movement. Workers installed the sections above open water. Beneath them, the construction safety net followed the work area. As each piece was added, the distance between the unfinished ends became smaller. From the San Francisco side, the roadway advanced north. From the Marin side, it advanced south. Sections also extended outward from the towers into the central span. The empty space narrowed. For years, people had spoken of connecting the two shores. Now, in 1936 and 1937, the connection could be watched as it physically approached completion. Perhaps someone on land returned every few weeks and noticed that the steel road reached farther than before. Perhaps ferry passengers looked up from the water and saw the open gap becoming shorter. The bridge was beginning to resemble the drawings that had circulated for years. The final structural piece of the roadway was placed by April 19, 1937. About 1 month remained before the public opening. The main physical connection now existed. A continuous structure reached from San Francisco to Marin County. The bridge that had once been declared impossible was standing. But before people could celebrate on the roadway, there was still paving, finishing work, testing, cleanup, and preparation. A construction site had to become a public highway. The bridge had to pass from the hands of its builders into the daily life of the region. The bridge was built during the Great Depression. In 1933, unemployment in the United States was extremely high. Jobs were difficult to find, and construction work on the Golden Gate Bridge was greatly valued. Except for highly specialized positions, much of the labor came from the local area. For the workers, the bridge offered wages at a time of economic hardship. It also offered something less measurable. Many of them understood that they were taking part in an engineering project unlike any other. Their workdays, however, were not lived as future history. They were lived in cold, wind, noise, fatigue, and concentration. The weather at the Golden Gate could change quickly. Fog could surround the structure. Wind could make walking difficult. Steel surfaces could be wet and cold. Some work took place inside cramped, dark sections of the towers or roadway. Other work took place hundreds of feet above the water. The men climbed ladders, moved along narrow steel, handled tools, guided heavy sections, and worked near open edges. Safety received unusual attention for a bridge project of that time. Workers wore hard hats. They used special goggles against the wind. They wore headlamps in enclosed areas. Respirators helped protect them from fumes associated with lead-based primer and hot riveting work. These protections, now familiar in industrial work, were notable innovations during the 1930s. The most famous safety measure was the net. Joseph Strauss insisted on placing a large, movable safety net beneath the area where men worked on the roadway. The net cost a significant amount, but it saved lives. 19 men fell and were caught. They formed an informal group with a darkly humorous name, the Halfway to Hell Club. Their survival became part of the bridge's history. A worker might fall from the steel, expecting open air and water below, and instead strike the net. The fall could still cause injury, but the net changed a fatal distance into a survivable one. For much of the construction period, the project's safety record was remarkably good, considering its scale and danger. There was one fatality before the final months. Then, on February 17, 1937, tragedy struck. A heavy scaffold carrying workers broke loose and fell. It tore through the safety net. 10 men died. 2 survived the long fall into the water. The accident occurred only a few months before the bridge opened. It brought the total number of construction deaths to 11. In a sleep story, it may be tempting to pass quickly over this sorrowful part. But the completed bridge should not be remembered only through records, color, and celebration. People lost their lives building it. Their names and stories belong to the structure, even though incomplete employment records mean that the identities of many other workers are no longer fully known. The official accounts describe the number of deaths as low compared with the danger and scale of the project. That is true in the context of construction at the time. Yet each death was a complete human loss. The bridge's achievement and its cost can be held together. We do not need to make the story harsh. We can simply pause. For a moment, imagine the bridge not as a postcard, but as a place of labor. Think of the people who arrived in the morning. Think of lunch carried to the worksite. Think of hands made rough by steel and rope. Think of the long climb to a tower position. Think of a diver checking the air hose. Think of a riveter waiting for the next heated fastener. Think of a crane operator watching signals. Think of the net hanging beneath the deck. Think of the workers who returned home after a shift. And think quietly of those who did not. Construction continued. The bridge reached completion ahead of schedule. The final cost was more than $35 million, but the project remained about $1.3 million below its final budget. The construction effort had lasted a little more than 4 years. During that period, workers had built foundations in deep water, raised 2 record-setting towers, spun 2 enormous cables, hung hundreds of suspender ropes, installed a roadway, and connected the approaches to existing roads. The bridge contained about 83,000 tons of structural steel in its original construction. Its towers were joined by around 1.2 million rivets. Each main cable held 27,572 wires. The center span extended 4,200 feet. The roadway stood approximately 220 feet above high water. The total length was nearly 9,000 feet. Numbers of this kind can become difficult to feel. Perhaps it is enough to remember that the bridge crossed almost 2 miles from end to end, while its central unsupported span stretched for nearly 4/5 of a mile. It was large enough to change the movement of an entire region. Yet it was also detailed enough that architects considered the shape of a railing and electricians considered the placement of a light. Scale and detail met in the same structure. By the spring of 1937, paint covered the steel in international orange. The roadway was ready. Toll facilities stood at the southern end. Approach roads connected the bridge with San Francisco and Marin. After decades of imagining, arguing, planning, and building, the public was ready to cross. The first great public celebration belonged to pedestrians. On May 27, 1937, before automobiles were allowed to use the bridge, people were invited to cross on foot. The Presidio history describes crowds forming early in the morning. By 6 o'clock, an estimated 18,000 people were already waiting. From dawn until dusk, the bridge belonged to walkers. Officials estimated that around 15,000 people passed through the turnstiles each hour. By the end of the day, roughly 200,000 people had taken part. They came in ordinary clothes and in costumes. Some walked, some ran, some danced, some moved on roller skates. Photographs from the opening show a roadway filled from side to side with people. For one day, the bridge was not mainly a transportation machine. It was a public promenade suspended above the Golden Gate. Imagine joining that crowd. The bridge is completely new. The paint is fresh. The towers, which are now familiar symbols, have never before carried a public gathering. Below, ferries continue to cross the water. Beyond the western side lies the Pacific. To the east are the bay, Alcatraz Island, and the city. The roadway may move slightly beneath the weight of the crowd and the wind. People look upward at cables that were spun only months earlier. They look down through railings toward the water. They stop for photographs. They continue toward the opposite shore. Many may have followed the controversy and construction for years. Some may have voted for the bonds. Some may have worked on the bridge. Some may have doubted it would ever be completed. Now they are standing in the middle of it. The walk across the main span would not have been a short one. From end to end, the bridge extended nearly 1.7 miles. For a relaxed walker, the crossing could take half an hour or more, especially with the opening day crowd. The towers would seem to approach slowly. The central span would open wide in front of each traveler. At the midpoint, both shores would be visible in opposite directions. Perhaps the scale of the bridge was most fully understood not from a photograph, but through the time required to walk it. A person moved step by step over a distance that had previously required a ferry. The connection was no longer an idea. It was beneath their feet. The following day, May 28th, the bridge opened to vehicles. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt participated from the White House. He pressed a special telegraph key, sending the signal that the bridge was open to the world. Sirens sounded. Ships blew whistles. The roadway began its new roll. The first automobile toll was 50 cents in each direction. That amount seems small now, but it was meaningful in 1937, especially after years of economic hardship. The toll helped repay the bonds that had financed construction. Traffic moved across the bridge, changing travel between San Francisco and the counties to the north. A driver no longer needed to wait for a ferry and load a vehicle onto a boat. Highway 101 could continue across the Golden Gate. The trip became part of the road network. The ferries had connected the shores for generations, and ferry service would remain important in the Bay Area. But the bridge changed the balance of transportation. Cars, trucks, buses, pedestrians, and later bicycles used the new route. The bridge became infrastructure. It was no longer only an engineering wonder visited for celebration. People crossed for work. They crossed for deliveries. They crossed to visit family. They crossed on vacations. They crossed in daylight and darkness, in clear weather and fog. A great public monument entered ordinary life. That transition may be one of the most interesting moments in the story. During planning, the bridge had been controversial. During construction, it had been dangerous and extraordinary. During opening week, it had been a festival. Then, almost immediately, it became part of a commute. The towers remained tall. The cables remained graceful. But for the person driving to an appointment, the bridge could also become simply the route ahead. Landmarks often live in these two ways. To a visitor, they are unforgettable. To a local resident, they may become familiar. The Golden Gate Bridge could be photographed by travelers from around the world, while also carrying someone home after an ordinary day. It could be both symbol and road, both art and transportation, both destination and passage. When it opened, the Golden Gate Bridge held two major world records. Its 4,200-foot main span was the longest suspension bridge span in the world. Its 746-foot towers were also the tallest bridge towers in the world. The span record lasted until 1964, when the Verrazano-Narrows Bridge opened in New York. The height record lasted much longer. Over time, other bridges became longer and taller. Engineering continued to advance. New materials, methods, and designs allowed even greater spans. Yet the Golden Gate Bridge did not lose its identity when its records were surpassed. A record describes a comparison at one moment. A landmark gathers meaning over time. The Golden Gate Bridge remained closely connected with San Francisco, California, the Pacific Coast, and the visual memory of the 20th century. Its proportions contributed to that lasting recognition. The main towers are tall but widely separated. The main cables descend in broad curves. The vertical suspenders create a fine repeating pattern. The roadway forms a strong horizontal line. The international orange color separates the structure from sky and water. The bridge appears large without appearing heavy. Its steel framework is deep and complex, yet from far away, the whole structure can look almost like a drawing. A few lines are enough to suggest it. 2 towers, 2 cable curves, 1 roadway. That visual clarity may help explain why the bridge became recognizable around the world. The American Society of Civil Engineers later named it one of the wonders of the modern world. It became one of the most photographed bridges anywhere. But the bridge was never only beautiful. Its form came from function. The high roadway allowed ships to pass. The tall towers supported long cable curves. The cables carried the roadway. The vertical suspenders transferred weight. The trusses stiffened the deck. The orange paint protected the steel and improved visibility. Its appearance grew from engineering, architecture, landscape, and maintenance working together. Fog is part of the Golden Gate. It enters through the strait from the Pacific, sometimes in long, low bands, and sometimes as a dense wall. On clear days, the entire bridge can be seen at once. In fog, the experience is different. A driver may see the roadway and nearby suspenders, but not the full curve of the cable. A person standing on shore may see the lower section of a tower disappear upward. From another viewpoint, only the top of a tower may rise above the white layer. The bridge can seem to separate into pieces. This changing visibility is one reason the international orange color is practical as well as beautiful. The warm color can remain visible against gray and white conditions. But paint alone cannot guide ships through heavy fog. The bridge has used foghorns since 1937. A system of 5 air-powered horns was installed to warn vessels near the structure. The signals follow patterns and pitches regulated for navigation. The horns are switched on when conditions require them. Their sound travels through fog that may hide the bridge completely. For people living near the Golden Gate, the foghorn can become part of the atmosphere of the place. A low signal sounds. Then there is silence. Then the signal returns. The sound does not reveal the bridge visually, but it tells ships that the structure is there. At night, lights perform another form of guidance. Warning lights mark the bridge for aircraft. Network lights assist vessels passing below. Red lights outline important parts of the structure. White and green signals identify the channel. The bridge therefore communicates in color, light, and sound. By day, international orange stands against the landscape. By night, lamps trace the towers and cables. In fog, horns speak through the air. These systems are less famous than the main span, but they belong to the bridge's continuing relationship with the sky and water around it. The Golden Gate is not a still stage. Ships pass beneath. Aircraft move overhead. Traffic moves across. Tides flow below. Wind presses against the deck. Fog changes visibility. The bridge must remain present to all of them. Wind has always been one of the bridge's great natural tests. The original designers expected the roadway to flex. That flexibility was part of suspension bridge theory. But engineers continued learning after the bridge opened. In 1940, the original Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington State collapsed during a windstorm after twisting dramatically. The disaster changed how engineers thought about the interaction between wind and long, flexible bridge decks. The Golden Gate Bridge had a different design and did not suffer the same failure. Still, its behavior in wind was watched carefully. On December 1st, 1951, a severe windstorm caused the Golden Gate Bridge deck to sway and roll enough that the bridge was closed. The event showed that the roadway needed greater resistance to twisting. During 1953 and 1954, engineers added lateral and diagonal bracing beneath the deck. The new bracing connected portions of the lower truss system and made the roadway more resistant to torsional movement. This was an important pattern in the bridge's history. Completion in 1937 did not mean the end of engineering. The bridge would continue to be observed, tested, repaired, and improved. A structure designed to last must be allowed to change. The original concrete roadway deck presented another long-term problem. Fog and mist carried salt from the ocean. Over the years, salt reached the reinforcing steel inside the concrete. Corrosion developed. Concrete began to deteriorate. Between 1982 and 1986, the original deck was replaced. The work was carried out in 747 sections over 401 nights. The bridge did not have to close completely to traffic throughout the project. Workers removed sections and installed new steel orthotropic deck panels. The replacement deck was stronger and approximately 40% lighter. Reducing weight was valuable because every pound of roadway had to be supported by the suspension system. The project gave the bridge a new deck while preserving its towers, cables, and overall appearance. A person driving across during the day might have noticed little of the nighttime sequence. Yet, over hundreds of nights, the roadway was renewed piece by piece. The bridge continued carrying traffic while parts of its original deck disappeared. Again, continuity depended on change. Earthquakes are another part of life in the San Francisco Bay Area. The San Andreas Fault lies only about 7 miles offshore from the Golden Gate. The bridge opened decades after the devastating 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and seismic forces were considered in its design. But knowledge of earthquake engineering developed greatly during the 20th century. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake caused major damage around the Bay Area. The Golden Gate Bridge remained standing, but the event reinforced the need for large-scale seismic improvement. So, retrofit work was planned and installed from one end of the bridge to the other. Parts of the approaches, anchorages, supports, and structural systems were strengthened or modified. Some connections were replaced. Some components were designed to move in controlled ways during shaking. The purpose was not to make the bridge absolutely motionless. As with wind, safe movement could be part of survival. Modern sensors were also installed to measure how the structure responds to earthquakes, wind, traffic, and changes in temperature. The bridge now produces information about its own movement. Engineers can study that information and compare actual behavior with expected behavior. The bridge that was calculated with slide rules and pencil now lives in an age of electronic monitoring. Its original designers tested a small tower model under load. Later engineers placed sensors throughout the full-sized structure. The methods changed. The question remained similar. How does the bridge respond to force? The answer is never based only on appearance. A bridge may look still while its parts are moving slightly. Steel expands as temperature rises and contracts as it falls. Traffic loads change from moment to moment. Wind pressure varies. Cables, towers, deck, foundations, and joints respond together. Monitoring allows this movement to be understood rather than merely guessed. The Golden Gate Bridge is therefore both a historic structure and an active engineering system. It carries the design decisions of the 1920s and 1930s. It also carries decades of later knowledge. Paint is one of the bridge's most visible forms of maintenance. The International Orange surface is not permanent by itself. The Golden Gate stands in salt air. Fog and mist settle on the steel. Wind carries moisture. Without protection, corrosion would gradually damage the structure. For many years, a popular story claimed that painters began at one end of the bridge, worked to the other end, and then immediately started again. The reality is more practical. Painting is performed where inspection shows that it is needed. Damaged coating is removed. Steel is prepared. Primer and protective layers are applied. International Orange is restored. The work never disappears entirely because the environment never stops acting on the bridge. Salt continues to arrive. Water continues to collect. Sunlight, temperature, and wind continue to affect surfaces. Maintenance teams continue to inspect and respond. The official history lists engineers, ironworkers, electricians, and painters among the people who care for the bridge. Their work is quieter than construction. There is no new tower rising each month. There is no opening day crowd waiting behind a gate. Instead, there are inspections, repairs, replacements, measurements, and coatings. A cable is opened so that inner wires can be examined. A light is reached by a lift and repaired. A section of steel is checked. A suspender rope is replaced. A sensor records movement. A painter prepares a surface. The bridge remains familiar because someone is always attending to unfamiliar details. All 500 visible vertical suspender ropes have been replaced, one by one. This kind of work allows the bridge to retain its historic form while renewing essential parts. The main cables are inspected by removing portions of their outer covering and examining the thousands of wires inside. Wedges can be inserted between wires so that inspectors can look deeper into the cable. The cable appears solid from a distance. Maintenance reveals its many individual elements again. The structure repeatedly returns to the same principle that shaped its construction. Large strength depends on small parts. A tower depends on rivets. A cable depends on wires. A deck depends on connections. A bridge's long life depends on repeated acts of care. Joseph Strauss was once asked how long the Golden Gate Bridge would last. He answered, "Forever." No human-made structure maintains itself forever. But the answer expressed confidence in the bridge, and perhaps confidence in the people who would continue caring for it. Forever, in this sense, is not a single achievement completed in 1937. It is a commitment renewed by every generation. The bridge has also gathered memories through public celebrations. Its 50th anniversary was marked on May 24, 1987. Organizers expected a large crowd, but far more people arrived than anticipated. Estimates ranged from about 750,000 to 1 million people in the surrounding area. Approximately 300,000 people crowded onto the bridge itself. Under the immense load, the normally curved roadway appeared to flatten near the center. Photographs show the deck filled with people from side to side. For a time, engineers were concerned. Yet the bridge was designed to flex under changing loads. The weight of the crowd did not come close to the ultimate capacity of the main cables, and the structure suffered no lasting damage. The event became a dramatic public demonstration of the bridge's flexibility. It also became a lesson in crowd management. When the 75th anniversary arrived in 2012, officials did not repeat unrestricted pedestrian access on the same scale. Instead, the celebration used other events and displays, including temporary lights and beacons. The anniversary history reflects the changing relationship between the bridge and the public. In 1937, 200,000 pedestrians celebrated a new connection. In 1987, hundreds of thousands returned to honor 50 years. By 2012, the bridge was an internationally known landmark, an essential highway, and a structure requiring careful security and traffic planning. The bridge did not grow physically larger during those years. Its place in public imagination did. People had crossed it for generations. Children who walked on opening day had become elderly. Families carried stories of construction workers. Visitors took photographs from the Presidio, Marin Headlands, Fort Point, boats, beaches, and city streets. The bridge appeared in films, advertisements, paintings, postcards, and news reports. Its image traveled far beyond California. Yet its actual location remained specific. It still connected San Francisco and Marin. It still stood above the Golden Gate Bridge. It still rested on rock, concrete, steel, cable, and human maintenance. Fame did not remove it from the weather. Fog still arrived. Wind still moved the deck. Salt still touched the paint. Traffic still crossed. Ships still passed below. Let us now imagine approaching the bridge slowly from the San Francisco side. This is not a new event added to the history. It is simply a quiet way to gather the details we have already heard. Behind us lies the city. Around us is the Presidio, a place whose history reaches back through American, Mexican, Spanish, and indigenous time. Ahead, the roadway rises toward the Golden Gate. Near the water stands Fort Point. The brick fort belongs to an earlier century, preserved beneath the steel arch of the southern approach. Above it, the bridge carries the road toward the first tower. The arch over Fort Point reminds us of Charles Ellis and the design problem that might otherwise have led to demolition. The road continues upward. International orange steel becomes more prominent. The color was chosen by Irving Morrow, not because the bridge is named Golden Gate, but because it offered both visibility and harmony with the setting. Street lights and railings carry the Art Deco influence of the 1930s. The tower grows larger as we approach. From a distance, it looked like a simple vertical shape. Closer now, openings, plates, braces, and rows of connections become visible. Somewhere inside that steel are hundreds of thousands of rivets. Below the visible tower, the foundation reaches down to rock beneath the water. Around its base is the great concrete fender, the structure workers once called the giant bathtub. To build it, divers descended through cold, dark water. They waited for the changing tide. They worked through air hoses connected to the surface. They cleared the seabed, placed charges, and guided forms. Other workers built the fender, pumped out millions of gallons of seawater, and prepared the foundation for the steel above. As we pass the tower, the central span opens ahead. The roadway stretches for 4,200 feet before reaching the North Tower. On each side, the main cable curves downward toward the center. Vertical suspenders descend at regular intervals. They are the strings of the giant harp described in the construction exhibit. Each suspender helps carry the weight of the roadway. The load rises into the main cables. The cables contain 27,572 wires each. Those wires were carried back and forth across the strait for 6 months and 9 days. What now seems like one continuous cable was once a sequence of individual crossings. The roadway beneath us was also assembled in sections. Steel trusses extend along both sides and below the pavement. They resist wind and distribute weight. The original concrete deck was later removed and replaced over hundreds of nights with a lighter steel deck. So even as we imagine crossing the historic bridge, we are crossing layers of time. Some parts date to the original construction. Some parts have been strengthened. Some have been replaced. Some have been monitored with modern instruments. The bridge remains itself while its materials and systems are cared for. At the middle of the span, the water lies far below. The average clearance above high water is about 220 feet. Ships can pass beneath, moving between San Francisco Bay and the Pacific. In fog, they may depend on the bridge's navigation lights and horns. In clear weather, the channel is open to view. To the west is the ocean. To the east is the bay. The bridge occupies the line between them, but water moves freely below. This was one of the essential conditions of the design. The harbor entrance had to remain open. The bridge could connect the land only if it allowed the maritime route to continue. The center of a suspension bridge is also a place of forces. The roadway carries its own weight and the changing weight of traffic. Suspenders carry that weight upward. The main cables pull toward the towers and anchorages. Wind presses from the side. Temperature changes the dimensions of steel. The deck moves slightly. A person crossing may feel almost nothing. The structure is still responding. The bridge's calm appearance is active, not passive. It is the calm of many forces held in balance. As we continue north, the second tower approaches. Its visible form closely matches the southern tower, yet the history beneath it is different. The southern foundation required the offshore trestle, divers, and giant fender. The northern foundation stood closer to the Marin shore. Above the water, the towers form a symmetrical pair. Below the water and ground, their circumstances differ. We pass beneath the second tower. The main cables now rise behind us and begin descending toward the northern anchorage. The roadway approaches Marin County. For travelers in 1937, this final portion completed something that ferries had done for generations in another way. San Francisco and Marin were now joined by continuous road. The city was no longer the largest American city dependent mainly on ferries for this regional connection. Highway 101 could cross the Golden Gate. The bridge altered routes, schedules, land use, business, and ordinary habits, but it did not erase the water. Even from the roadway, the scale of the strait remains clear. The bridge does not make the Golden Gate small. It reveals how large the crossing is. When we reach the Marin side and look back, the bridge's full system becomes easier to see. The road we crossed appears narrow relative to the towers. The main cables trace two long arcs. The suspenders form repeated vertical lines. The southern approach returns to the land above Fort Point. The city rises beyond. Fog may be moving in from the ocean, or the sky may be clear. The bridge may appear bright orange, deep red-orange, or muted by distance and atmosphere. Its appearance changes, but its arrangement remains recognizable. And now, having crossed in imagination, we can look backward through time as well. We can remember the ferries moving between the shores. We can remember the first proposals on paper. We can remember Joseph Strauss traveling and speaking for the project. We can remember opponents questioning navigation, security, cost, and competition. We can remember voters approving bonds during the Depression. We can remember Amedeo Giannini and the Bank of America agreeing to purchase them. We can remember Moisseiff, Amann, Ellis, and Morrow shaping the engineering and architecture. We can remember the tower model under test. We can remember geologists loading a small area of serpentine rock. We can remember the groundbreaking crowd at Crissy Field and the carrier pigeons released into the air. We can remember timber trestles damaged by a ship and a storm. We can remember divers working beneath the current. We can remember the giant bathtub rising from the water. We can remember steel traveling through the Panama Canal. We can remember climbing derricks moving upward between tower legs. We can remember red-hot rivets and cables spun wire by wire. We can remember the safety net. We can remember the 19 men it saved. We can remember the 11 workers who died. We can remember the roadway sections approaching one another over open water. We can remember the pedestrian crowd on May 27, 1937. We can remember President Roosevelt's signal the next day. And we can remember that, after all the ceremony, the bridge began carrying ordinary journeys. The history of the Golden Gate Bridge did not end on opening day. It continued each time the bridge met a new condition. It continued in the windstorm of 1951, when the deck's movement led engineers to add stronger bracing. It continued when salt reached the original concrete roadway and the deck was replaced section by section. It continued after the Loma Prieta earthquake, as seismic improvements became a long-term priority. It continued when suspender ropes were replaced one at a time. It continues whenever a cable is inspected, a light is repaired, a sensor records movement, or a layer of international orange is renewed. The bridge's story is therefore not only a story of construction, it is a story of stewardship. The people who designed and built the bridge could not know every challenge it would face. They could not know the exact traffic of later decades. They could not know every future earthquake study, material, sensor, or repair method. They created a structure with enough strength and adaptability to be improved. Later generations learned from the bridge and cared for it in return. There is a quiet relationship between old design and new maintenance. The original towers continue to carry the cables. Modern monitoring helps engineers understand their movement. The historic color continues to define the bridge. Modern coatings help protect the steel. The original suspension form remains clear. New deck sections and retrofit components work within it. The bridge appears to hold one moment in the 1930s, but it is never frozen in that moment. It moves. It ages. It is repaired. It is measured. It continues. Perhaps this is why the bridge can feel both historic and alive. A ruin belongs nearly to the past. The Golden Gate Bridge belongs to the past and the present at once. It carries the marks of the people who built it and the work of the people who maintain it. It remembers ferries while carrying cars. It preserves Fort Point while carrying a modern highway above. It retains hand-calculated design while being watched by electronic sensors. It stands as a monument while performing an ordinary task every day. When we look at the bridge from far away, we may not think about any of these details. We may simply see the orange span between two headlands. The scene can appear effortless. The cables make smooth curves. The towers stand evenly. The roadway forms a level line. Fog moves around the steel. But the bridge was not effortless. It required decades of persistence before construction began. It required public risk during the Great Depression. It required difficult calculations without computers. It required tests, arguments, redesigns, and compromises. It required work below the sea and high above it. It required local labor, specialized contractors, and steel transported across a continent and through a canal. It required thousands of repeated operations. It required courage. It also required grief. And after completion, it required care. Perhaps the beauty of the bridge comes partly from the fact that all of this complexity has been gathered into such a clear form. The difficult history is not visible all at once. It has been organized into towers, cables, roadway, color, and space. The eye follows the cable gently upward. The tower receives it. The cable descends toward the center. The roadway continues across the water. Everything seems to know where it belongs. For someone preparing to sleep, there may be comfort in that order. Not because every part of the history was peaceful, it was not, but because many different efforts made over many years came together into one enduring connection. Now imagine evening settling over the Golden Gate. The last daylight remains in the west. The hills grow darker. Lights begin to appear along the bridge. Traffic continues, but from far away it may look like a slow line of white and red points. Ships move below. The tide continues through the strait, as it did long before the bridge was built. Fog may gather over the ocean. If it moves inland, the western part of the bridge may fade first. The tower lights remain visible for a while. Then perhaps only a few red signals can be seen. A foghorn sounds. The bridge is hidden, but it has not gone anywhere. Its foundations remain on rock. Its anchorages hold the cables. Its towers rise through the fog. Its roadway continues from one shore to the other. The parts remain connected even when they cannot all be seen. For tonight, you do not need to hold every date, name, or measurement in your mind. You do not need to remember how many wires are inside each cable. You do not need to remember the height of the towers or the year of every repair. Those details can drift away. Perhaps only the shape remains. 2 towers above dark water. A long orange roadway. Cables curving gently through the mist. And beneath the visible structure, the memory of an ancient river valley, rising seas, indigenous homelands, ferries, engineers, divers, steelworkers, painters, and generations of travelers. The bridge continues across the Golden Gate. The water continues beneath it. The fog continues around it. And the night grows quieter. You may imagine the bridge from the shore, slowly disappearing into the soft gray air. First, the far roadway becomes faint. Then the distant tower loses its edges. The cables fade. The nearer tower remains for a little longer, and then, perhaps, the whole bridge becomes only a gentle suggestion in the darkness. There is nothing more you need to do. The story can continue without your attention. The bridge can remain where it has stood since 1937, connecting San Francisco and Marin County through wind, fog, sunlight, and night. And you can let the facts, the voices, and the images grow quieter now. Let the roadway stretch calmly into the distance. Let the great cables rest in their long curves. Let the towers stand above the moving water. And if sleep is already near, you may simply allow it to come. Good night.